This is lecture 3 for week 5. As we continue the theme of self and identity, this lecture looks at temperament. So first, what is temperament? So if you've been keeping up with the readings and the lectures for this subject, you may have noticed that temperament has already come up a few times. It came up in the week 3 when we talked about socialization as being an element of what the person brings to their interactions, and a person's temperament can influence how they are socialized by different people in different social contexts. And then temperament also comes up related to attachment. So there's a relationship between attachments, forming an attachment, and temperament, and we'll look at that later in this lecture. But let's start now by really focusing on temperament and what is temperament. Temperament is about a habitual pattern, a natural style of interacting with or reacting to people, places, and things. It's a kind of typical response people have in terms of, we'll look at some different dimensions, but how they typically would react, a pattern of behaviors and actions and interactions. And it's a biologically based element of who we are, and a biologically based element of self. So there's a lot of evidence that suggests that temperament is inborn. It's probably related to our genetics because you can see it early in life. It's not necessarily something that is caused by nurture. It comes from nature. So temperament is the aspect of ourselves that comes from nature. And temperament tends to be relatively stable over time. So you might change on some of the dimensions of temperament that we'll look at, but typically you can notice a pattern very early in life, in infancy, and these aspects of the self tend to be fairly stable. So you may be wondering, what's the difference between temperament and personality? So as I mentioned in the first lecture, personality is a somewhat enduring set of traits that there's some stability there from young adulthood through later adulthood. So what is the relationship with temperament? And temperament is different from personality. Personality is more complex and reflects things like interests and drives and motivations, whereas temperament is about a natural way, what feels natural to a person in terms of acting and interacting with others. But there is a relationship between temperament and personality. So research suggests that there's a relationship between temperament and personality in later life, that temperament is really the building blocks of personality, the early foundation for personality. And temperament comes from nature. There's a lot of evidence that it's inborn, again. And as a person develops and has the influence from their environments and their relationships, that's the influence of nurture, and they develop their personality. But a child's temperament may shape certain aspects of personality. So a sensitive child who is somewhat withdrawn may develop a love of solitary walks and quiet countrysides and reflective reading and spending time on their own. So there is a relationship between our natural tendencies and the ways that we develop things like our interests and our motivations and our drives. So your reading talks about a few different theories and theorists related to temperament, but I'm going to focus on Chess and Thomas, which was also discussed in the readings for week 3. It's been a particularly influential theory, and if you're a new parent, you often hear you have a slow to warm up child, or you have an easy child or a difficult child, and that comes from Chess and Thomas's work. And they also developed a concept called goodness of fit, which is really, it also ties together a lot of what we're at in this subject related to social context and self. So we're going to focus on this particular theory and set of concepts related to temperament. So Alexander Thomas and Stella Chess and their colleagues in the 1950s they were working on a longitudinal study. So they were looking at children over time, and it was a longitudinal study about how it included an observation of children's responses to everyday situations. The longitudinal study, that was the design and the type of data collection, one of the things was observation. How did children respond to everyday situations? And they found 9 temperament characteristics or traits by observing these responses to everyday situations. And they found that these 9 traits, you could observe them from shortly after birth and that they continue to develop, influence development in important ways throughout life. And this was, at the time, it drew a lot of attention because other theories that we've talked about, like psychoanalysis, which I mentioned in the first lecture, and behaviorist theories, which I talked about in week 2, suggested that it was all about environment, it was all about nurture. But actually, Justin Thomas's theory suggested that there is aspects of the self and of personality, the early roots of personality, of temperament, that are inborn, that come from nature. So that might, garnered a lot of attention. And they also developed something that I'll get into more in this lecture. They explored how the transactions between children and their parents influence each other's behavior. So this is the bidirectional concept, which we talked about in week 3, that people are not just being influenced by other people and being socialized by other people, they're also influencing back their socialization agents. They're influencing the interactions that they have. And they characterize this idea of the bidirectional transactions and this influence as the goodness of fit between the child's temperament and the social environment. So these are the 9 temperament traits that Chess and Thomas found in their research. And again, I'm going to describe each one, but as you think about this, this is about how an individual would react across similar situations. When they're having a similar type of experience, they would tend to react somewhere on a spectrum for each of these 9 temperaments in a particular kind of habitual way. So first was activity level. So this is the child's, you could call it like their idle speed. So are they really revved up, or are they really kind of low energy? Are they kind of just calm, sit a lot, quiet in terms of their energy level? Or are they super active? How active is the child typically? Intensity. This is the energy level of a response. So when, for example, if a child is told, no, you can't have that, are they kind of low intensity? Okay. Or are they, oh, no, I want that. That would be high intensity. So how strong is their response to something, whether it's positive or negative? Rhythmicity is really about the predictability of biological functions. So how predictable is it when the child's going to go to sleep, when they're going to eat, and even elimination. So some people have very regular bodily functions, and others, there's really not very much predictability. Approach withdrawal. This is about how a child responds in terms of a new situation or to strangers. So is the child, quite withdrawn, or do they go and approach a new situation that's novel? So is this a child that, you come into a room full of children and the children who come straight up to you want to hug you and tell you all about themselves and their pet hamsters? Or is this the child that really hangs back and is more shy and withdrawn? Adaptability. This is around how a child adapts to transitions and changes. So you can see sometimes for a child, if they're doing something like in a child care center and it's time to wrap this up, we're going to go from inside to outside, or we're going to go have lunch now. Some children adapt easily. They'll stop doing their thing. Some children have a harder time. They need more time to switch to a new activity. Mood. So this is the tendency, the way that child tends to react to the world. Do they tend to be, often happy and sort of positive? Do they tend to have a lower mood? Have even signs of kind of more of being kind of low and unhappy? Persistence. So this is how long a child continues in activities in the face of obstacles. So as soon as they encounter some kind of challenge, this puzzle piece is not quite fitting, do they keep going or do they give up immediately? Distractibility. So this is the ability of a child to concentrate and pay attention, particularly when they're not particularly motivated to do an activity. So this is really an important quality for something like schoolwork, right? Now, you're not always going to want to do the schoolwork that you're asked to do as a child. So is a child ready to give it up right away? I don't really want to do this anyway, or will the child stick with something, a task? And then sensory threshold. This is about how sensitive the child is in terms of their sensory physical stimuli. So some children are quite responsive, even over responsive to things like, particularly things like touch. Like they might really get bothered by a scratchy tag or scratchy shirt, or don't like to walk on sand. Oh, it's so uncomfortable. It's not. And some children doesn't seem to bother them, how cold or hot it is, or how something tastes like. They're not as strongly influenced by those sort of sensory experiences. So these are, again, looking across these 9 temperament traits, these are the traits that Chess and Thomas identified in their observational study, that you can observe from a very early age differences in people in terms of how active are they, how intense are their responses, how adaptable are they when they switch activities, how are they persistent in a task, are they easily distracted. These are things that there's evidence that these are things that you come along with in terms of your genes, that a lot of these come from nature. And underlying, there's some sort of big categories that you can see in these temperament areas. One is around energy. So some children are very active. They're always moving around, always doing things, and they have strong responses. You can't have this toy, or, they might, again, have a low, okay, sort of, I'm easy, low intensity. Those are often grouped in terms of energy, the child's energy. And then there are other ones that are about how the child is in terms of their adjustability. So that's things like persistence. Do they stick with a task? How do they respond to a novel situation? That's the approach withdrawal. And adaptability. So, how are they when they're asked to switch to some kind of new activity, for example? So those are 2 underlying dynamics for temperament, or what's the kind of energy level for a child? How adjustable are they to different situations? The Chess and Thomas temperament types are often grouped into 3 broad temperament categories, particularly for babies. You hear this a lot. Easy, slow to warm up, and difficult. So, and you hear about that about children too, but when you have a new baby, people will often say, oh, do you have an easy baby, or you have a difficult baby, or do you have the slow to warm up baby? So that really groups some of the main traits, some of the traits. It just kind of selects some of the important traits of the 9 temperamental traits. And, those are kind of profiles for certain types of babies or children. So the easy child is, in terms of their bodily functions, very regular. Okay, so this is the baby. It's not hard to get this baby to go to sleep. It's not hard to get this baby to eat. And even elimination, you know what to expect in terms of the number of nappies. It's a person or a baby with a fairly regular body rhythm. The approach withdrawal. This is an infant or a child who's positive in terms of new situations. So they're up for going to a new park or a new person coming by for a visit. The child is adaptable. So, when a situation changes, okay, we're going out now, or we're stopping this game, they will, okay, they'll just adapt to the next thing. And intensity of reactions, if you say, okay, we're gonna have to stop doing this, or okay, that's fine, like a reaction, not having a big histrionic attack. And then quality of mood tends to be positive, tends to be a pretty happy child. So wouldn't you say that's the easy child? That's the child that what to expect in terms of their bodily functions, they're open to new situations, they're adaptable and pretty happy. The slow to warm up child is one where it takes them a while in terms of new situations. So when they may not be as regular really as the easy child in terms of their bodily function, but a real difference is around new situations. So they don't initially, when a new person comes around, they're not necessarily going to approach. They're going to kind of be withdrawn. So that's the slow to warm up to you as a new person, if you're the new babysitter or you're a friend coming by for a visit. Not so adaptable, so sort of slower in terms of adaptability, wants more time, like I'm not ready yet, or not wanting to sort of switch activities. Still has a somewhat mild reaction, but it may have a more negative mood than the easy child. So again, this is the real distinction here is around how they respond to novel situations and to change. They're not so easy. They take a little bit more time. They're not so sure about novel situations. Then the difficult child, This is a child where their body rhythm is all over the place. Sometimes, this could be the child that's described as having colic, where they're crying all the time. I can't get the child to stop crying, and it worked this way to put them to sleep. I used the hair dryer, but this time it's not working. I'm driving the child around in my car. What do I do with this child? So the body rhythm, things like eating, sleeping, and elimination, not so regular. Approach, withdrawal, so not so sure about those new situations, sticking back. More so in terms of adapting to a new situation, to a new event, new activity. And having, this is really, the major characteristic is having intense reactions. So that the difficult child is the one that's pitching themselves on the ground and having the tantrum when they don't want you to put that sweater on them, or they don't want that kind of cereal, or they don't want you to go now. It's the intense reactions. And then the quality of mood tends to be more negative, so more unhappy. So this is you can contrast this to the difficult and the easy child. The difficult child is really intense and less predictable, less easygoing. So it can often be more fights, in terms of doing things. And that sort of speaks then to, where it's sort of easy, who it's easy or difficult for is really the parent, in terms of the relationship with the parent. So goodness of fit is the idea, and it relates to socialization, about what is the connection like in terms of the parent and the child. What is the interaction between the temperaments of those two people, and how does that then relate to the quality of attachment? So when there is a goodness of fit, where there's compatibility in terms of temperament, that's more associated with having secure attachment. So we'll get back to this goodness of fit. So basically with goodness of fit, the question is there a match, or is there some kind of a mismatch? And, between a child and an important person, or a context that they're in, like childcare, for example. And when there's a good match, this is known as goodness of fit. And it's important to understand it's not the child, there's something wrong with the child, it's something wrong with the fit. So it's about the fit between a child and another person, or the context. And so it's important to understand temperament so that you don't punish a child, because they might be a highly active child in a context that is not supportive of having a lot of activity, like a church, for example, where you're meant to sit quietly. So it's not that there's something wrong with the child, it's that there's a mismatch there in terms of what's expected in that environment and the child's temperament. So just to give you an example, here's a little scenario. So the Andersons have two sons, Josh, age 11, Ryan, age 9. Both boys are bright, they achieve well in school, they're involved in sports, they have lots of friends, but they're very different. And the parents wonder, how did we get these two different boys? So Josh moves slowly, he's at a slow pace, he's easygoing, he's adaptable, he's laid back. Whereas Ryan is energetic, he's intense, he's quick to respond, and he races through life at top speed. Josh, who's the easygoing, adaptable, laid back one, fits his parents' lifestyle. They're also laid back. And they're often puzzled and upset and irritated by Ryan, who's highly active and intense, and they find his behavior intrusive and disruptive. So that's a sort of example of there's nothing wrong with being energetic, intense, quick responding, and racing through life at top speed. And if you have two parents that are like that, that creates a kind of a good environment for the goodness of fit, because y'all be racing around together. But if you have the laid back parents, they have goodness for a fit for their other child, for their child Josh, who moves at a slow pace, who's adaptable, who's easygoing. So it's something to think about in terms of, again, back to our theme of relationships. What is the goodness of fit like? Is there some kind of conflict in a relationship because people have very different temperaments in terms of some of these different dimensions? And the last point I wanted to make is about temperament and culture. So your reading talks about how different temperamental tendencies can be observed in infants in different nationalities. And it's a question about, really about that idea of whether a child is compatible with the demands and expectations of the society they belong to and that they're being socialized into. So that kind of goodness of fit. Some children's temperaments may be more valued by the culture that they're part of. others may be less valued. So some aspects of temperament may be more rewarded in a particular culture, and that gets back to socialization, where maybe some children are punished for some aspects of their temperament because it doesn't fit well with what is expected of that culture. So the reading talks about things like, temperament. You can sort of see that with Australian infants, it mentions that they tend to live up to the reputation of Australians for being easygoing, whereas North American infants tend to be more active and intense. So it really does speak to these tendencies may be inborn, but there is something about the environment also that is probably rewarding certain types of interactions. But we really see this comes out in terms of socialization again, in terms of caregiving practices, environments, the way we teach children in schools relate to a set of traits. So really the way schools set up, for example, really prefers children to be low activity and sit at their desks. It's not about the high activity, intense, that would be, getting the children to run around and do more learning by doing. So if you think about this, there's sort of this element, it's really about how does temperament and different people's temperament, how does that interact with the culture they belong to, and how does that relate to how they're socialized? Because again, people bring something to their experiences of being socialized. They're not passive, it's bi-directional, and that's what goodness of fit suggests, is that children are influencing the interactions that they have, and sometimes there's a good fit there in terms of the person or the context responding positively to a child's temperamental traits, and sometimes there's a poor goodness of fit. And if you do go into working with children, it's a good thing to remember. You shouldn't be punishing children for their temperament because they really don't have control over that. But sometimes that certainly happens. So that'll conclude our discussion for now of temperament.